When my parents passed, their will felt like a final, stinging verdict on my place in the family. My younger brother Evan was handed their beautiful, well-maintained home in Omaha, the place where all our memories were made. My inheritance, a dilapidated house on a forgotten piece of land in the emptiest corner of Wyoming. My wife, Claire, looked at me with an expression of pure contempt. She called me a doormat, a coward without the courage to confront Evan for this blatant injustice. "Get out," she seethed, her voice like ice. She threw my bag at the door and told me not to even think about coming back until I'd fought for what was rightfully mine. So I drove west, the bitterness of her words chasing me down the highway. My heart was a chaotic mix of raw hurt and a faint, illogical curiosity about this property I was banished to. Little did I know this trip wasn't an exile. It was a turn that would alter the entire course of my life. I should probably introduce myself. My name is Leo Vance and I'm 42. I've spent my career as a banker at a small branch back in Omaha. If I had to put a label on my existence, I'd call it a placid stream. Always calm, always predictable, but never truly alive with energy. I'm not the type who enjoys laying out his life story, but it's the only way to explain why I'm standing here now. This is me, in front of a collapsing structure that's somehow mine, clutching a set of rusted keys that feel impossibly heavy. My emotions a tangled mess I can't begin to unravel. My childhood unfolded on a street in Omaha where every house was a carbon copy of the next. We lived in a middle-class world of white walls, red-tiled roofs, and lawns trimmed with unnerving precision. My parents, Robert and Helen Vance, were salt-of-the-earth people. My father spent his days as an auto mechanic, his hands permanently stained with grease, while my mother invested her patience and care into classrooms of elementary school students. They loved Evan and me. Of that I have no doubt. But their affection was a quiet, steady thing, never loud or demonstrative. It was shown in duty and provision, not hugs and praise. We were taught to be kind, to always yield in a disagreement, and to place the family's quiet harmony above all else. Yet even in that peaceful world, I always felt a strange vacancy, a sense that a crucial piece of my own identity was missing. I could feel its shape, but I could never give it a name. My parents were deeply reluctant to speak about our family's history. The past was a closed door. The only clues I ever got were fragmented whispers, half-finished sentences suggesting my great-grandfather was part of the Cheyenne Nation, one of the indigenous peoples who roamed the endless prairies of the Great Plains. My grandfather Samuel was supposedly the last one who carried any real connection to that culture. But he passed away when I was far too young to form any lasting memories, taking that entire world with him. My father seemed determined to erase our past, convinced that assimilation into city life was our only path forward. He maintained a resolute silence about my grandfather and our Cheyenne bloodline, as if speaking of it would summon a ghost he wasn't prepared to face. The knowledge I did possess felt like a collection of faded photographs, brief, disconnected images shared in hushed tones. I knew my great-grandfather had been a masterful hunter. I knew my grandfather Samuel had worked cattle on a sprawling ranch somewhere near the Wind River Range, and I knew that our family had made the difficult choice to abandon their ancestral lands, seeking a different kind of life in Omaha. I never held it against my parents. I understood their fear. They simply wanted to give us an easier path, to shield us from the weight of being seen as different in a city where our heritage could draw suspicious stares and closed doors. Still, there were moments I'd catch my own reflection in the mirror, really seeing the dark shade of my eyes and the thick, straight black of my hair. A question would rise up sharp and clear. Who am I, really? A quiet ache would start in my chest, a longing for a connection I couldn't articulate. It was a hunger for a part of myself I'd never been allowed to know, and I had no map to find it. Evan, My brother couldn't have been more my opposite. Younger by 4 years, he moved through the world as if he owned it. He was the one who commanded every room he entered. Tall, effortlessly handsome, with a dazzling smile that could disarm anyone. But beneath that charm was a core of pure ambition. Evan was razor-sharp and possessed a chilling willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, no matter who stood in his way. He effortlessly captured all of my parents' attention, and I learned to step aside. I told myself it wasn't jealousy, it was my duty. I was the older brother, and it was my job to let him have the spotlight. But in the quiet moments, a different thought would creep in, echoing Claire's accusations. Maybe I am just weak. Claire. Even just thinking her name sends a painful clench through my chest. We met 15 years ago at a party thrown by mutual friends. She was the daughter of a wealthy Omaha family, a woman who radiated confidence. She was intelligent and decisive, with piercing green eyes and blonde hair that was always perfectly coiffed. She told me she was drawn to my quiet nature. "You're different from the other men I've dated," she'd said back then. "You're honest, dependable." I was completely captivated from our first conversation, mesmerized by the way she seemed to fill every room with a vibrant energy. We got married 2 years later. Her parents gave us a small house in the Omaha suburbs as a wedding present. It was a generous gift, one I appreciated, but it carried a weight I could never shake. It was a constant reminder of my own inadequacy, a feeling of being perpetually indebted. Our marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but it was stable. Claire thrived in the fast-paced world of real estate, her days a whirlwind of client meetings and closing deals. I, meanwhile, was content with my predictable routine at the bank, finding a strange comfort in its lack of drama. I found a quiet satisfaction in the predictable rhythm of my job, the clean logic of balancing ledgers and the calm of numbers. But Claire was never satisfied with my contentment. She wanted more from me, or perhaps more from me. She wanted me to be ambitious, to fight my way up the corporate ladder and become the powerful man she believed I should be. "Leo, you can't just let people walk all over you," she would say, her tone sharp with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "You let Evan manipulate everyone. You let your coworkers take credit for your work. Are you really content to live your entire life as a nobody?" I never knew how to answer her. The truth was, I had no desire to compete. I didn't want to become a shark like my brother, clawing my way to the top. But every word she spoke was a tiny blade carving away at my self-worth. Am I really that weak? I'd wonder late at night. Have I just let my entire life happen to me without ever once fighting for what I want? That question and everything else was shattered one afternoon in early March. A call came from the hospital, the voice on the other end clinical and detached. My parents had been in a car accident on the interstate. A semi-truck had lost control, swerving across the median and hitting their car head-on. They were gone. The rest is a blur. I don't remember the drive to the hospital, only the feeling of my legs giving out beneath me in the sterile, cold hallway. I collapsed against the wall, the world dissolving into a storm of tears I couldn't stop. Evan arrived sometime after I did. He projected an air of calm control. But I saw the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his hands as he filled out the necessary forms. The funeral was a suffocating affair, heavy with a grief that felt both immense and hollow. Evan and I moved through it like strangers, exchanging only clipped necessary words about the arrangements and the condolences of visitors. Claire remained at my side, her hand resting on mine. But I could feel a chasm between us. I sensed a judgment in her gaze, a deep disappointment that I wasn't performing my grief in the strong, stoic way she expected. Perhaps she was waiting for me to step up, to say or do something that would assert my position as the older brother, the new patriarch. A week after we buried them, my parents' lawyer summoned us to his office for the reading of the will. I wasn't anticipating any surprises. My parents had lived comfortably but were by no means wealthy, and I simply assumed their modest assets would be divided equally between us. I couldn't have been more wrong. When the lawyer began to read, the floor seemed to drop away beneath my feet. Helen and Robert Vance leave their house in Omaha, Nebraska, along with all personal property and financial assets to their younger son, Evan Vance, the lawyer stated, his voice flat and professional. He cleared his throat before continuing. To their elder son, Leo Vance, they leave a property located in Park County, Wyoming, along with all of its contents. The words hung in the air, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I was utterly stunned. The Omaha house was our entire childhood. It was the backdrop for every memory I had of my parents, every holiday, every scraped knee. It was a comfortable, solid home, meticulously cared for and worth at least $1 million in the current market. But the house in Wyoming? I had no idea it even existed. My parents had never once spoken of it. The only connection I could make was a faint, hazy recollection that my grandfather Samuel had once lived somewhere out in the mountains. Evan turned to me, a strange, unreadable smile playing on his lips. "Guess Mom and Dad knew you never really liked the city," he said, his tone hovering somewhere between a joke and a serious observation. I couldn't bring myself to reply. I just managed a tight nod, desperately trying to swallow the bitter tide of injustice rising in my throat. I felt like I'd been slapped. Claire, however, had no such restraint. The moment the car door shut, she erupted. The drive home was a storm of her fury. "Are you seriously okay with this, Leo?" she practically screamed. "They leave you some worthless, run-down shack in the middle of nowhere while Evan gets the entire estate? You're the older son. How can you just sit there and let your little brother humiliate you like that?" "It was their decision," I managed to say, my voice raspy and thin. "I didn't want this to happen, Claire." "Their decision?" She let out a short, brutal laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Your parents obviously thought you were worthless, and you won't even put up a fight. You're just weak, Leo. You have always been weak." Her words landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I wanted to defend myself, to shout that I didn't care about the house, that all I wanted was to avoid a war with Evan and keep what little peace we had left. But the words wouldn't come. A cold dread settled in my stomach, the terrifying possibility that she was right. That was the night Claire threw me out. She told me she couldn't stand to live with a man who had no backbone, who wouldn't even stand up for himself. "Go, Leo," she said, her voice flat and final as she pointed toward the front door. "Go to that pathetic little house of yours in Wyoming, and don't even think about coming back until you've done something to prove you're a man." I didn't fight her. There was no point. I numbly packed a small bag with a few changes of clothes, grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door, and drove away into the darkness. I had no idea if I was running away from my life or searching for something to replace it. All I knew was that when the sun came up, I was on the interstate heading west. I was driving toward Wyoming, and the set of rusty keys the lawyer had pressed into my hand felt like a dead weight in my pocket, pulling me toward a future I couldn't begin to imagine. According to the legal documents, the Wyoming property was located just outside a small town called Sage Creek, a place tucked away between imposing mountains and vast, unending pine forests. I'd never set foot there, yet as I navigated the winding mountain roads, a bizarre feeling washed over me. It felt impossibly like I was coming home to a place I'd somehow forgotten. Or maybe the exhaustion and emotional battering of the past few weeks had finally broken me, and my imagination was just filling in the gaps. Dusk was settling over the valley when I finally arrived. The house appeared before me like a ghost. a crooked, dark silhouette against the last vestiges of daylight. It was smaller than I had pictured, with shingles peeling off the roof like sunburnt skin, several windows shattered, and thick, grasping vines climbing the walls as if trying to pull the whole structure back into the earth. I should have felt a wave of crushing disappointment. Instead, I felt a spark of genuine curiosity. There was something about this place, an aura of mystery that called to me. It felt like it was holding a secret, one that was just waiting to be found. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, my hand wrapped so tightly around the keys that the metal dug into my palm. A cold wind swept down from the peaks, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine needles and damp earth. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing it in, my heart hammering against my ribs with a strange mix of fear and anticipation. So this is it, I thought. This is my inheritance. Whatever this place held, whatever story it had to tell, I was going to find it. I started walking toward the porch, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel the only noise in the immense silence. The bundle of keys felt impossibly heavy in my hand, cold with the chill of long-forgotten years, as if they were forged from the very secrets of the past. The front door groaned in protest as I forced the key into the rusted lock. It took a hard shove from my shoulder to get it to budge, and the moment it swung open, a thick, musty odor washed over me. The smell of damp, decaying wood and decades of settled dust. I stepped inside. What little light remained of the day filtered down through holes in the roof, casting long, eerie stripes across a cracked and warped wooden floor. In the center of the main room, an old, rough-hewn table stood like a lonely sentinel next to a massive brick fireplace, its hearth black with ash and soot. There were no signs of life anywhere. No light fixtures, no photographs on the mantel. Not a single personal effect to suggest a family had ever called this place home. It was utterly barren. But instead of disappointment, that same strange feeling from outside intensified. It was an inexplicable pull, a feeling that this house was speaking to me in a language I couldn't quite understand. It was as if it knew I hadn't come here just to see a piece of property. It knew I had come here to search for something. I dropped my backpack on the floor and pulled out the flashlight I'd thankfully thought to bring from Omaha. Its weak yellow beam cut through the gloom, chasing shadows into hidden corners. The house wasn't big, just this main living area, a tiny kitchen off to one side, and a single hallway that led to what I assumed were bedrooms. I explored each room slowly, the sound of my own footsteps echoing like a nervous heartbeat in the profound silence. The first bedroom was nearly empty, containing only a rusted metal bed frame and a moth-eaten blanket lying in a heap on the floor. The next room was clearly used for storage. A few rotting wooden crates were scattered around, their contents long since turned to mulch. But when I reached the end of the hall and pushed open the last door, my pulse quickened. This door was completely different from the others. It was crafted from heavy, solid oak and covered in elaborate carvings. I saw eagles with outstretched wings, stylized suns with radiating lines, and patterns that flowed across the wood like a winding river. It was a level of artistry I had never encountered in my life back in the suburbs of Omaha. My hands were shaking slightly as I began trying the keys from the ring one by one. None of them turned the lock. I went through the entire bundle, my frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The door remained stubbornly shut, but that frustration was mixed with an overwhelming curiosity that pushed me forward. I wasn't giving up on this. I ran the flashlight beam around the edges of the doorframe again, more carefully this time, and that's when I saw it. A tiny gap near the floor in the bottom corner. Could it be a hidden catch? I knelt down, my fingers tracing the outline. I felt a loose wooden panel. It took some effort, but I managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow opening. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst as I squeezed myself through the gap and into the space beyond. I was in a small, windowless room no bigger than a walk-in closet. I pointed my flashlight around, and the beam landed on dusty wooden shelves that lined the walls. They were filled with objects unlike anything I had ever seen up close. There were clay pots painted with intricate geometric patterns, pieces of tanned hide embroidered with richly colored threads, and a magnificent eagle feather headdress, its white plumes still looking pristine despite the years of neglect. In the far corner, my light found an old wooden chest, its lid intricately carved with the image of a wolf, head thrown back, howling at a full moon. I could feel the air catch in my throat. These weren't just random artifacts or decorations. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that they were sacred. Each object felt like a single word in a much larger story, a story I was just beginning to read. I approached the chest with a reverence I didn't know I possessed and opened the lid slowly, carefully, as if I were afraid of shattering something priceless and irreplaceable. Inside, resting on a bed of faded fabric, was a thick, heavy, leather-bound book. Its pages were yellowed and brittle with age. I lifted it out and gently opened it to the first page. A line of elegant, handwritten script flowed across the top. To those who carry the blood of the Cheyenne, you must preserve and cherish this. And below it, a signature that made a jolt of electricity run through me. Samuel Vance. Beside his name was a date, August 15th, 1947. This was it. This was the real inheritance. It wasn't the crumbling house or the worthless land. It was what had been hidden away inside it. I sank to the dusty floor, the book open in my lap, and began to turn the pages. It was more than just a journal. It was a living chronicle. It was the history of my family, the history of the Cheyenne people told in my grandfather's own hand. He wrote about my great-grandfather, a respected warrior named Maheo, which he noted meant great spirit in his language. He described a life I could barely imagine, days spent on the open plains, hunting the great buffalo herds, and nights filled with sacred ceremonies performed under an endless canopy of stars. His words painted a vivid picture of a world that was both beautiful and brutal. He also wrote of the profound loss, the deep, bleeding wound that opened when the white settlers arrived, systematically taking their land and forcing his people onto reservations, their way of life shattered forever. But most of all, my grandfather Samuel wrote of resilience. He detailed how my great-grandfather Maheo had gathered and hidden these sacred objects, risking everything to protect their culture from being stolen or destroyed. He did it in the hope that one day his descendants would find them, reclaim their history, and continue to tell the story of their people. I didn't even realize I was crying until a tear fell from my cheek and splattered onto the fragile page. In that dusty, hidden room surrounded by the ghosts of my ancestors, I felt closer to my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and my people than I had ever felt to anyone in my entire life. All those years I'd spent in Omaha, I had been a stranger to the most fundamental part of myself. But now, right here, I felt like I was finally being seen, being called by my true name. Not Leo Vance, the quiet banker from the suburbs, but Leo, descendant of Maheo, a man who carried the blood of the Cheyenne. I spent the rest of the night in that small room, losing all track of time as I carefully examined each artifact. Every single object had a story woven into it, which my grandfather had painstakingly recorded in the journal. The magnificent eagle feather headdress, he wrote, was used by the shamans in ceremonies to call for rain. The beautifully painted pottery vases held the cremated ashes of warriors who had fallen in battle, hidden away here to prevent their desecration by the U.S. Army. It was a museum of a stolen history, a testament to survival. I found a small drum, its surface made of taut deer hide. When I tapped it gently with my fingertips, it produced a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate right through me. I had no idea what these items would be worth in terms of money, but I understood with absolute clarity that they were priceless. This wasn't a collection of objects. It was history itself. It was the living, breathing soul of a people I was only just beginning to know. The next morning, I made a call to an old college friend, Mark, who was now an archaeologist working at the University of Wyoming. I gave him a brief, hesitant summary of what I had found, and he immediately agreed to drive out and take a look. When Mark stepped through the narrow opening into the hidden room, his professional composure vanished. His eyes widened like a child who had just stumbled upon a pirate's treasure chest. "Leo, do you have any idea what you're sitting on?" he asked, his voice shaking with excitement. "These artifacts, my God, they could be worth millions of dollars. And I'm not just talking about their monetary value. Historically, this is a monumental find. This is the tangible legacy of the Cheyenne, the kind of collection that museums all over the world would kill to acquire." The number hit me like a physical shock. Millions of dollars? That kind of money could solve every problem I had. It could buy back the Omaha house 10 times over. It could pay off all of Claire's debts and set me up for life. I could live in comfort, never having to worry about anything again. But as soon as the thought entered my mind, a powerful, visceral resistance rose up from deep within me. These artifacts couldn't be sold. They didn't belong behind glass in a museum or locked away in some private collector's vault. They belonged here. They belonged to my family. They belonged to the Cheyenne people. Mark left a few hours later, promising to get in touch with a leading expert on Plains indigenous cultures for a more formal appraisal, and to help me understand the full context of the find. I remained in the old house, drawn back to my grandfather's journal. With every page I turned, I learned more about the profound struggles my ancestors had faced. My grandfather wrote about my own father, Robert, and his difficult decision to leave Wyoming and move to Omaha. He had done it with the best of intentions, hoping to give his own children a better, easier life, free from the prejudices he had known. But my grandfather also wrote of the deep pain he felt as he watched my father consciously distance himself from his Cheyenne heritage. Robert believed that assimilation was the only way for his sons to survive in that world, he wrote. But I fear that if we forget where we come from, we lose the most important part of ourselves. Those words struck me with the force of a physical blow. I thought of my parents and their steadfast refusal to ever speak of my grandfather or our people. I had always assumed they were trying to protect Evan and me from discrimination. But now, sitting in this sacred space, I finally understood how wrong they had been. The past wasn't a burden to be discarded. It was an anchor. It was the source of our strength. It was our identity. In the days that followed, a new purpose took hold of me. I started to fix up the house. I swept the dust of decades from the floors, patched the gaping holes in the roof with salvaged shingles, and began to carefully clean the artifacts, treating each one with the reverence one would reserve for a sacred jewel. With each passing day, I felt a growing connection to my grandfather, to my great-grandfather Maheo, and to a long line of ancestors I had never known. It was as if their spirits were stirring back to life inside of me. My dreams became vivid and strange. I dreamt of vast, sun-drenched prairies stretching to the horizon, of the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of drums beating in the night. I saw a man with long, dark hair braided down his back, standing atop a hill, his gaze fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. One afternoon, while I was gently wiping the dust from one of the painted clay pots, a sharp knock on the front door made me jump. Sage Creek was a tiny, isolated town, and other than Mark, I hadn't seen another living soul since my arrival. I opened the door to find an older man standing on the porch. His skin was the color of tanned leather, and his long silver hair was tied back in a neat braid. He wore a simple work shirt and jeans, but his eyes were piercing, and for a moment I had the uncanny feeling that he could see straight into my soul. "I am David Nighthorse," he said, his voice deep and calm. "Mark sent me." "You are Leo, Samuel Vance's grandson?" I nodded, my voice stuck in my throat, and gestured for him to come inside. David stepped into the main room, and I led him to the hidden chamber. As his eyes took in the collection of artifacts on the shelves, they shone with a complex emotion I couldn't immediately identify. It looked like pride, deeply intertwined with a profound and ancient pain. He reached out and gently touched the eagle feather headdress, his weathered fingers trembling slightly. "Do you understand how important these are?" he asked, his voice low and reverent. "These are not just objects. They are the spirits of your ancestors. They are the living memory of our people." David began to tell me about the history of the Cheyenne, stories that went far beyond the brief entries in my grandfather's journal. He spoke of the wars, the sacred ceremonies, and the systematic efforts to suppress and destroy their culture. He explained how it only survived because of people like my grandfather, brave individuals who became secret keepers of their heritage. He said my grandfather had been one of those guardians, hiding these sacred items to keep them from falling into the hands of those who wanted to erase the tribe's memory from the earth. "Samuel always believed that one day someone from his own bloodline would find this place," David said, his sharp eyes meeting mine. "He believed that person would have the heart to understand. That person is you." I felt a tremendous weight settle onto my shoulders, but it wasn't a crushing burden. It was accompanied by a fire igniting deep in my chest. In that moment, I knew I was no longer Leo, the timid banker from Omaha. I was someone else entirely. I was a descendant of warriors, of storytellers, of a people who had fought and died to protect who they were. But the path forward was not a simple one. A week later, my past came roaring back to my doorstep. Evan pulled up in a polished, expensive SUV, striding into the ramshackle house with that same easy, confident smile he always wore. "Brother Leo, I heard you struck gold out here," he said. His tone was light, almost joking, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Mark mentioned it to a colleague, and you know how word travels. Those old things are apparently worth a fortune." A hot surge of anger went through me. "They're not for sale, Evan," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "They are our family's legacy. They belong to our people." Evan threw his head back and laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that echoed in the small house. "Legacy? Oh, come on, Leo, don't be so naive. This isn't about some dusty old history. This is about money. We sell them, we split the cash, and you could live like a king. Hell," he added, leaning in conspiratorially, "I'd even be willing to trade you the Omaha house for this place and its contents. Straight up." His offer landed like a punch to the gut. The Omaha house, the home filled with every memory of our parents, of our entire childhood. It was a tempting, poisonous thought. For a fleeting, treacherous moment, a part of me wanted to say yes. I could go back to Omaha, back to Claire, back to the life I knew. I could have it all back. But then my gaze fell on my grandfather's journal lying on the table, and on the magnificent eagle feather headdress hanging on the wall, and I knew I couldn't do it. "No, Evan," I said, and my voice was stronger and clearer than I had ever heard it. "They don't belong to us to sell. They belong to our people." Evan just shook his head, looking at me as if I'd completely lost my mind. "You're going to regret this, Leo," he said, his voice laced with pity and contempt. He turned and walked out without another word. "You always regret being weak." He drove away, leaving me alone with a gnawing sense of unease. His offer, the Omaha house in exchange for this place and its priceless contents, was like a stone thrown into a calm pond. It sent ripples through my mind, disturbing thoughts I had tried to push down. I retreated to the secret room and sat on the floor, clutching my grandfather's leather-bound book, my eyes fixed on the headdress hanging on the shelf. The beam of my flashlight caught the white feathers, making them glimmer like a constellation of tiny stars in the darkness. But my thoughts were no longer in this room. They were miles away, tangled up in the life I had left behind. My mind was drifting, pulled back east toward Omaha, toward Claire, toward the predictable, stable life I once believed was all I needed. I got up and walked out onto the porch, needing air. The night in Sage Creek was sharp and cold, the wind carrying that now familiar scent of pine and damp earth. Above me, the sky was a breathtaking spectacle, a vast black canvas ablaze with stars so brilliant I felt I could trace every constellation with my finger. I had never seen a sky like this back in Omaha, where the glow of the city lights washed everything out to a dull orange haze. Here, it was pristine, immediate, and real. It felt as if I were standing at the very center of the universe. I found myself wondering if my grandfather Samuel had ever stood on this same porch, looking up at this same sky, feeling the same profound sense of awe and insignificance that I was feeling now. Had he ever been forced to confront the kind of temptations that were now tearing me apart? The next morning, the past reached out to me again. My phone rang, and I saw Claire's name on the screen. When I answered, her voice wasn't the icy, dismissive tone I remembered from our last conversation. It was softer, almost gentle, reminiscent of the way she used to speak to me when we were first falling in love. "Leo," she said, her voice tentative. I heard from Evan about what you found out there. Is it true? Did you really find some kind of treasure?" I gripped the phone, my knuckles turning white. My heart began to pound a heavy, anxious rhythm against my ribs. "It's not treasure, Claire," I replied, my voice coming out raspy and strained. "It's a legacy. It belongs to my family, to the Cheyenne people." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Claire gave a soft, breathy laugh. "You're always such a romantic, Leo. But I'm a practical woman. If those things are really worth millions like Evan claims, you should sell them. We could pay off all our debts, buy a beautiful new house, travel the world. Don't you want that kind of life with me? A life where we never have to worry about money again?" Her words were a seductive whisper, painting pictures in my mind that I had once desperately wanted. A bigger house, trips to tropical beaches, the respect and admiration of our friends and family. A life without the constant quiet pressure of not having enough. But even as the images flickered through my head, that same deep, unshakable resistance rose up from my core. These artifacts weren't a lottery ticket. They were the living history, the very soul of my ancestors. To sell them would be to betray not only my grandfather and his memory, but the new part of myself I was just beginning to discover. "Claire," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You don't understand. These things are not for sale. They mean more than money." She sighed, and in an instant the gentle tone was gone, replaced by the familiar sharp edge of her frustration. "You're still the same old Leo," she said, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Always romanticizing everything. Do you really think a pile of old relics is going to change your life? They won't pay our bills. They won't bring you happiness. You're living in some kind of foolish fantasy, and frankly, I'm tired of waiting for you to wake up and face reality." I wanted to argue with her. I wanted to tell her that I had found a kind of happiness, not in the promise of money, but in the profound connection I felt to this place and to my own history. But I remained silent. I knew, with a weary certainty, that nothing I could say would make her understand. She couldn't see what I saw in this dilapidated house. She couldn't hear the ancestral whispers I heard in the wind moving through the pine trees. "I'm coming to Wyoming," she announced, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "I want to talk about this face to face. You can't just keep running away forever." Then she hung up. I stared at the black screen of my phone, a sense of dread washing over me. A storm was coming. Claire had always possessed the power to unmoor me, to make me question my own convictions, but this time had to be different. This time I was determined not to let her shake my resolve. I went back into the secret room and sat on the floor in front of the old wooden chest. Seeking solace and strength, I opened my grandfather's journal once more, hoping to find comfort in his words. I found a passage where he wrote about my great-grandfather Maheo. A British trader had come to their winter camp offering gold and silver in exchange for the tribe's sacred bundles and ceremonial pipes. Maheo had refused him, even though his people were starving, and the trader's offer could have saved them. Money can buy food to fill our bellies today. My grandfather had transcribed Maheo's words, but it is our spiritual connection that will sustain our people through all the generations to come. Those words were like a sudden bright flame, pushing back the darkness and doubt that had been creeping into my heart. I knew then that I had to be strong. I had to be strong not just for myself, but for the ancestors who had fought so hard to preserve this legacy. Claire arrived a week later on a gray, drizzly afternoon that matched my mood. She emerged from her car wearing a stylish beige trench coat, her blonde hair pulled back in an elegant knot. She looked completely out of place, a figure of sophisticated urban life dropped into this wild, rugged landscape. Stepping over the threshold, she wrinkled her nose in distaste at the peeling paint and the cracks in the wooden floor. "You're actually living like this, Leo?" she asked, her voice dripping with a mixture of disbelief and pity. "This isn't a home. It's a pile of ruins." I didn't bother to respond. I just led her down the hall to the secret room. When she saw the artifacts arranged on the shelves, her eyes lit up, but not with the awe or reverence I had hoped for. Her gaze was sharp and appraising, the look of a real estate agent calculating the value of a property. She picked up one of the painted clay pots, her manicured fingers tracing its patterns as if she were assessing its market value. "These things, they really are beautiful," she conceded. "Are you absolutely sure they're worth a lot?" "Because if they are, I know a guy who runs a major auction house in New York. We could make an absolute fortune." "Claire," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I intended, "they are not for sale." She turned to face me, her practiced smile vanishing. "Are you being serious right now? You're just going to let them sit here in this falling down shack and rot along with you?" "Leo, this is our chance to change everything." "It might be a chance to change your life," I said, looking her directly in the eye, "but not mine. I found something here. I found my purpose. These artifacts aren't just things. They are the living history of my family, of the Cheyenne people. I have a responsibility to protect them." Claire shook her head and stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. Her voice softened, becoming persuasive and intimate. "You've changed, Leo," she said quietly. "I feel like I don't even know you anymore. But I still want us to work. I want us to try again. Just sell them and we can start fresh. I'll forgive you for everything. For letting Evan walk all over you, for all the ways you've disappointed me. We could finally be happy." Her words were meant to be a balm, an offer of reconciliation, but they felt like a twisting knife. This time, however, they didn't have their intended effect. I didn't waver. I gently removed her hand from my arm, feeling a sense of clarity and strength I had never known before. "Claire, I don't need your forgiveness," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I am simply doing what I know is right. And if you can't accept that, then maybe we really don't belong together anymore." She stared at me, her green eyes glistening with tears. But as I looked at her, I realized it wasn't love I saw in her expression. It was the shock of defeat. It was the look of someone who had just lost control of a situation they thought they could manipulate. "You will regret this, Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You'll end up all alone in this dump and you will regret it." She turned and walked out, slamming the front door behind her. I was left standing in the silence of the secret room, the artifacts my only companions. But I felt no regret. For the first time in my adult life, I felt as though I had stood my ground against temptation, against pressure, against the crushing weight of other people's expectations. I was no longer Leo, the weak-willed man who would do anything to keep the peace. I was Leo, descendant of Maheo, and I had chosen to protect my legacy. The temptations, however, were not over. A few days later, another stranger arrived at my door. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit and introduced himself as a representative of a private art museum in Chicago. He claimed to have heard about the artifacts through an anonymous source. I had no doubt it was Evan. He made me an offer on the spot, $3 million for the entire collection. He sweetened the deal by promising my name would be prominently displayed on a plaque, honoring me as a major donor. "Mr. Vance, this is an opportunity for these important items to be seen and appreciated by the world," he said, his voice as smooth and polished as his expensive shoes. "We will display them with the dignity and respect they deserve." I looked at him, a cold anger rising in my chest. "Deserve?" I asked, my voice flat and hard. "You think locking them away behind glass in a museum in Chicago is what they deserve? These things belong to the Cheyenne people. They belong to the descendants of the men and women who lived and died to protect them. You can't buy their spirit." The man gave a small, condescending smile and shrugged his shoulders. "I am simply making an offer, Mr. Vance. If you should change your mind, here is my card." He placed it on the porch railing and walked back to his car, leaving me with a familiar sense of unease. I knew he was right about one thing. There would be others. There would be more offers, more pressure, and I would have to find the strength to face them all. After the encounter with the man from Chicago, I knew I couldn't just keep these artifacts locked away in this hidden room forever. They needed to be protected, yes, but not by hiding them from the world. They needed to be brought into the light so their stories could be told and their spirit could live on through education and community. The idea for a cultural center started to form in my mind. Not a sterile, silent museum, but a living, breathing place where the Cheyenne people and anyone else who was interested could come to learn, to connect, and to feel a sense of pride in this powerful heritage. The first person I called was David Nighthorse. He came to the house early one morning, bringing a thermos of hot, sweet tea and a warm, encouraging smile. I laid out my fledgling idea for him, and as I spoke, he nodded slowly, a thoughtful gleam in his eyes. "You are walking the right path, Leo," he said when I finished. "Your grandfather Samuel would be very proud of you. But this is not a journey you can take by yourself. You will need the community to walk with you." David began to introduce me to other members of the Cheyenne community in Park County. He took me to meet elders, artists, and activists, people who had dedicated their lives to preserving their culture. I met a woman named Sarah Little Bear, a master of traditional beadwork, and an elder named Benjamin Stone Calf, who knew hundreds of ceremonial songs by heart. To my surprise and relief, they didn't treat me like an outsider. They welcomed me as if I were a long-lost relative finally returning home from a difficult journey. In their company, I felt a sense of belonging I had never experienced before. Not with Claire, not even with my own brother, but here, with people who shared my blood and my history. Sarah and Benjamin helped me flesh out the idea for the cultural center. We decided to restore my grandfather's house itself, transforming it from a forgotten ruin into a vibrant space where we could display the artifacts. It would also be a place to hold classes on the Cheyenne language, on traditional crafts like beadwork, and to share the old stories and ceremonies. I used the entirety of my life savings to buy the necessary building materials, and once we started, members of the community began showing up to help with the work. Over the next few weeks, the old house was slowly brought back to life. Together, we replaced the rotting roof, repainted the faded walls, and cleared a space outside to build a ceremonial circle. The sounds of hammers and laughter filled the air, replacing the lonely silence. But as our project grew, we learned that not everyone was happy about what we were doing. One evening, while I was working on the porch with Sarah, she told me that Evan had been in contact with a local real estate developer attempting to sell the property out from under me. A hot wave of fury washed over me, but Benjamin urged me to remain calm. "Your brother is blinded by greed," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "But you do not have to let his darkness into your heart. You must focus on your purpose." I took his advice and hired a local lawyer to block Evan's attempts to sell the land. After a brief legal battle, I secured full, undisputed ownership of the property. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it made me feel stronger and more resolute than ever. I was no longer afraid of confronting Evan or Claire or anyone else who tried to take this legacy away from me. On a bright, clear summer morning, the Cheyenne Heritage Center officially opened its doors. We held a traditional dedication ceremony, the deep, resonant sound of the drum echoing through the valley as the smoke from burning sweetgrass rose toward the sky. David led the ritual, and I stood at his side, wearing a shirt Sarah had painstakingly beaded for me, my heart swelling with a pride so profound it almost hurt. Dozens of people from the Cheyenne community and other nearby tribes attended, along with a surprising number of curious local residents who wanted to learn more about the culture we were trying to preserve. I stood before the assembled crowd, holding a microphone, my hands shaking slightly. For the first time, I shared my story with others. I spoke of my journey from Omaha to Sage Creek, of discovering the hidden room and the artifacts, and of how this place had helped me finally understand who I truly am. "I spent most of my life thinking I was weak," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "But I've learned that real strength doesn't come from money or power or ambition. It comes from knowing where you belong and from having the courage to protect it." When I finished, the crowd erupted in applause, and I saw tears glistening in Sarah's eyes. After the ceremony, a young girl came up to me, shyly holding out a small beaded necklace she had made. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said quietly. "I never really thought I could be proud of being Cheyenne, but today I am." Her words were the greatest gift I could have received. They were a profound affirmation that I had made the right choice. I understood then that the Heritage Center wasn't just a building to house old artifacts. It was a place to nurture pride, to inspire hope, and to forge the kinds of connections that could heal a community. Standing there amidst the sounds of laughter and conversation, the scent of sweetgrass still hanging in the air, I felt a sense of peace I had never experienced before. But I also knew with a deep certainty that my journey was far from over. This house and the legacy it contained had helped me find my roots, but more importantly, they had helped me find myself. I, Leo Vance, the man once dismissed as weak, the man who had lived a life of quiet compromise, was now standing at a new and unfamiliar crossroads. It wasn't because I had transformed into someone else entirely, but because I had finally embraced the person I was meant to be. A man with Cheyenne blood, a man with a sacred responsibility to protect his ancestors' legacy, and a man with a heart that finally understood what it meant to search for meaning. In the weeks that followed the center's grand opening, I was busier and more fulfilled than I had ever been. My days started early with a strong cup of coffee as the sun rose over the mountains. Some days I would work with Sarah Little Bear, helping her arrange the artifacts for display while she carefully explained the history and significance of each piece, just as David Nighthorse had explained them to us. On other days, I would sit with Benjamin Stone Calf for hours, listening intently as he taught me the ancient ceremonial songs, his powerful voice rising and falling like an echo from the open plains of our ancestors. I was still clumsy, my attempts at the Cheyenne language often mangling the pronunciations and making everyone laugh. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't embarrassed by my mistakes. I knew that each small step, each new word I learned was bringing me closer to the home I had never known. But I didn't feel strong all the time. There were nights after the center had closed and everyone had gone home when I would sit alone in the quiet of the secret room. I would stare at my grandfather's leather-bound journal and wonder if I was truly capable of carrying this monumental responsibility forward. The pressure wasn't just external anymore. It wasn't just about Evan or Claire or the endless stream of offers to buy the artifacts. The deepest pressure now came from within. I was terrified of failing. I was haunted by the fear that I would somehow dishonor this legacy, that I wasn't worthy of the trust my grandfather and the Cheyenne community had placed in me. One evening, as I was gently cleaning the feathers of the headdress, David came into the room. He didn't speak at first, just sat down on an old wooden crate and held a braid of sweetgrass in his hands. He lit it, letting the fragrant smoke curl through the still air. After a long moment of silence, he finally looked at me. "You are carrying a heavy worry," he said, his voice as low and steady as the wind moving through the pines. "I can see it in your eyes." I let out a long sigh and carefully set the headdress down. "I just don't know if I'm doing this right, David," I confessed, the words tumbling out. "I want so badly to protect these things, to make this center a meaningful place, but I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm not capable of it. I didn't grow up Cheyenne. I'm just a banker from Omaha who stumbled into his heritage a few months ago." David smiled, a slow, knowing expression that spoke of a man who had seen too much of life to be easily shaken. "Do you think your great-grandfather Maheo was never afraid?" he asked gently. "He faced down armies knowing he could not win the war, but he fought anyway, for his family, for his people. Strength is not the absence of fear, Leo. True strength is doing what you know is right, even when your hands are trembling." His words were like a fresh, clean wind, clearing the fog of doubt from my mind. In that moment, I understood that this journey was not about achieving some kind of perfection or becoming an expert overnight. It was about having the courage to keep moving forward, even when I couldn't see the final destination. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a small necklace woven from sweetgrass and adorned with a single blue bead. "Wear this," he said, placing it in my hand. "Let it remind you that you are not walking this path alone. Your ancestors are always with you." I slipped the necklace over my head, feeling the cool, dry strands of grass against my skin. From that night forward, whenever the old doubts began to creep in, I would reach up and touch the necklace. In my mind, I could feel the steady presence of my grandfather Samuel, my great-grandfather Maheo, and David Nighthorse standing right behind me, lending me their strength. My journey of self-discovery didn't just happen within the walls of the house or the Heritage Center. It unfolded in countless small, quiet moments, in the everyday lessons the Cheyenne community so generously shared with me. One afternoon, Sarah invited me to her home, where she was teaching a group of young children the art of traditional beadwork. I sat in the corner, completely mesmerized as I watched their small, nimble hands move across the tanned hide, creating intricate patterns of breathtaking beauty. Sarah patiently explained the meaning behind each design, the sharp zigzag representing lightning, the perfect circle symbolizing the sun, the source of all life. I listened intently, feeling as though I too were a child, learning the alphabet of my own culture from scratch. "Mr. Vance, you should try it," a little boy named Daniel called out, his eyes sparkling with a mischievous grin. I laughed and shook my head, but Sarah gently nudged me toward an empty chair. "Don't be shy, Leo," she said with a warm smile. "Every journey begins with a single step." I fumbled awkwardly with the loom, my clumsy fingers tangling the threads and earning a fresh round of giggles from the children. But when I finally managed to finish a small, crooked square of fabric, a wave of pure, simple joy washed over me. It wasn't because I had created something beautiful or impressive. It was because I had dared to try in the first place. In that moment, I realized that this was the kind of strength I had been missing my entire life. It wasn't the strength to dominate or to win at all costs. It was the quiet strength to learn, to grow, and to not be afraid of failure. But every journey has its trials. One morning, as I was setting up for a Cheyenne language class at the center, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from Evan's lawyer. He was suing me, claiming co-ownership of the property and arguing that our parents' will was ambiguous and therefore invalid. The letter felt like a physical blow, leaving me dizzy and disoriented. I had foolishly believed that my battle with Evan was over, that he had accepted defeat after I secured the legal title. I couldn't have been more wrong. This wasn't just about money for him anymore. This was about power. He wanted to prove that I was unworthy, that in the end I would always be the loser. My first call was to David. He came to the center right away. We sat together on the porch, my gaze fixed on the distant hazy mountains as I explained the situation. "I'm just so tired, David," I admitted, my voice rough with exhaustion and despair. "I'm just trying to do the right thing, but why does it have to be so hard? Evan, Claire, all these people trying to buy the artifacts. It feels like the whole world is pushing against me." David was silent for a long time. Then he raised a hand and pointed toward the sky, where a lone hawk was soaring on the thermal currents. "Do you see that hawk?" he asked. "It flies so high, but not because there is no wind blowing against it. It flies high because it has learned how to use the force of that wind to lift itself higher. Your challenges, Leo, are that headwind. You must not let them knock you to the ground. You must learn to use them to help you soar." His words shifted something inside of me, giving me a completely new perspective. Evan, Claire, all these obstacles, they weren't just enemies to be defeated. They were lessons to be learned. They were tests of my resolve. I decided then and there that I would face Evan's lawsuit, not with anger and resentment, but with a quiet and unshakable determination. I hired the best lawyer I could find, and we began to prepare for the trial. In the meantime, I poured all of my energy into my work at the center, refusing to let the looming legal battle distract me from my true purpose. With each passing day, I felt my own strength growing. It wasn't the arrogant confidence of someone who knows they are going to win. It was the quiet resolve of someone who knows they are fighting for the right reasons. The trial was held in Cody, a few hours' drive from Sage Creek. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Evan for the first time since he had stormed out of the house. He still looked as handsome and self-assured as ever, dressed in an expensive suit. But as I looked at him, I saw a hollowness in his eyes that I had never noticed before. The distinct emptiness of a person who is chasing nothing but money and status. When I was called to the stand to testify, I told my story without hesitation or apology. I spoke of my journey to Wyoming, of finding the artifacts in my grandfather's journal, of building the cultural center with the help of the Cheyenne community, and of my profound conviction that I could not let this sacred legacy fall into the hands of those who would not honor it. I am not doing this for myself, I said, looking directly at the judge. "I am doing this for my family, for the Cheyenne people, and for all the ancestors who fought so hard to keep this history alive." Evan, in stark contrast, spoke only of the property's monetary value and the potential market price of the artifacts, insisting that he was entitled to his fair share of the inheritance. But I watched the judge, an older woman with intelligent, discerning eyes, and I could see that she was completely unmoved by his talk of numbers and profits. In the end, she ruled in my favor. She declared that the house and all of its contents belonged to me, citing the clear and unambiguous language of my parents' will and my demonstrated commitment to preserving the cultural significance of the legacy they had left me. As we filed out of the courtroom, Evan looked at me, his expression a mixture of shock and anger, but he didn't say a word. For a moment, I wanted to tell him that I hadn't fought him to spite him, that despite everything, I still loved him as my brother. But I knew that, for now at least, he wasn't ready to hear it. I just gave him a small nod and walked away, feeling a tremendous weight lift from my shoulders. Back in Sage Creek, I held a small celebration at the center to thank the community for their unwavering support throughout the trial. We built a bonfire under the vast starry sky, and Benjamin Stone Calf led us in singing traditional Cheyenne songs as we shared stories of our ancestors late into the night. As I stood before my friends, I realized I was no longer the timid, uncertain man who had arrived in this town with nothing but a set of rusty keys and a broken heart. I was Leo Vance, a man who had finally found his own inner strength, not through winning a battle, but through having the courage to live a life that was true to himself. Inspired by my grandfather's journal, I began to write a book, a chronicle of my own story interwoven with the history of my family. I wanted to ensure that future generations, children like Daniel and the little girl who had given me the beaded necklace, would always know that they were the carriers of a powerful and precious legacy. I also threw myself deeper into learning about Cheyenne culture, participating in ceremonies and even trying my hand at traditional hunting methods, though my clumsy efforts usually just made Benjamin Stone Calf laugh until he had tears in his eyes. My happiness no longer came from what I possessed, but from what I was able to give back. Every time a child at the center learned a new Cheyenne word, every time the deep voice of the drum sounded during a ceremony, I felt as though I were repaying a debt to my ancestors. Not with money, but with love, respect, and a profound sense of responsibility. One evening, as I stood on the porch of the old house gazing up at the star-dusted sky, I had the distinct feeling that my grandfather Samuel was somewhere out there smiling down on me. I reached up and touched the sweetgrass necklace David had given me and whispered into the night, "Thank you for believing in me." A cool wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the clean scent of pine, and in that moment I knew that no matter how difficult this journey might become, I would never have to walk it alone. I was no longer Leo, the weak man who always yielded to others. I was home. I was Leo, descendant of Maheo, a man who had finally found his purpose in protecting the legacy of his ancestors. And deep in my heart, for the very first time in my life, I was truly and completely proud of my Cheyenne heritage.